Okay, hi class. This is lecture 8, photosynthesis. So if you're using the Campbell biology textbook, it's chapter 10. And if you happen to be using the OpenStax textbook, this is chapter 8. So again, I mentioned how cellular respiration and photosynthesis tie really neatly together, actually. So how do photosynthetic cells use light to change carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules and oxygen? It's through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis happens in plant cells in an organelle called the chloroplast. So if you remember when we took a tour of the cell, so chloroplasts convert the light energy from the sun, and they take the water and carbon dioxide that they breathe in and use that light energy to transform and generate organic molecules and oxygen. And those organic molecules and oxygen are used by cellular respiration, which generates ATP, and also carbon dioxide and water, which also powers photosynthesis. So it's all circular. So photosynthesis is the process that converts that solar energy into chemical energy inside chloroplasts. Photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world, directly or indirectly. So I like to think about what you eat in a day and how each item can basically be traced back to photosynthesis. So even if you ate something, so for sure if you ate something that is a plant or comes from like a plant product, then that obviously came from photosynthesis. So if you had rice today, if you had a fruit or a vegetable, but even other things, like if you had carne asada tacos, the carne asada comes from a cow, which ate grass, and it's the photosynthesis that occurred in the grass and on the cells that made the organic molecules that the cows could then use and break down for energy. So ultimately, yeah, photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world, directly or indirectly. So we can have different terms for different kinds of organisms depending on where they get their energy. So autotrophs are what are called self-feeders. So auto means like self, and then troph usually refers to like energy. So autotrophs are self-feeders. They sustain themselves without eating anything derived from other organisms. So autotrophs are the producers of the biosphere. We can also add other terms based on where they like fall under in like an ecosystem and the energy in an ecosystem. So autotrophs in an ecosystem, they're the producers of the biosphere. They produce organic molecules from carbon dioxide and other inorganic molecules. So this is a figure from the OpenStax book that I think shows this really well. So producers like plants, make the energy from sunlight. And so they are autotrophs that like in this, in a biosphere are producers. They produce those organic molecules from inorganic molecules. Consumers then eat the producers. So that's going to be on the next couple slides. So almost all plants are photoautotrophs. They use the energy of sunlight to make organic molecules. So we definitely ascribe, think of plants when we think about photosynthesis. But photosynthesis also happens in algae, certain other protists, and some prokaryotes. So if you remember, kingdom Eukarya has 4 big groups. And so there is, within Eukarya, there's plants, animals, fungi, and protists. And so protists are technically eukaryotes, but a lot of them are single-celled, but they have organelles, so they're still eukaryotes. So that's what protists are, just as a reminder. You'll get this a lot more in the next course in the series. But protists are eukaryotes. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that some protists can do this. And some prokaryotes, like cyanobacteria, can also do photosynthesis, as well as algae and plants, and even some bacteria. So, yeah, some prokaryotes, certain protists, and other algae. And so heterotrophs get their organic material from other organisms. They are the consumers of the biosphere. So, for example, animals, they consume the producers, and so that's how they're getting their energy and organic material. And there are other things too that consume other living things. Sorry, so some consume living things, like animals. But there are also some other things that eat dead organic material or feces, and these are called decomposers. So they eat stuff that's decomposing. And in that way, they're also getting their stuff from something else. And so even now, even in a way that we didn't think, like photosynthesis is powering our cars, basically. So fossil fuels, like gasoline that we use for, powering our cars, fossil fuels were formed from the remains of organisms that died hundreds of millions of years ago, representing ancient stores of the sun's energy. Because fossil fuels, they're not fossils of like dinosaurs, they're actually fossils of very early plants. So the fossil fuels that we use for energy ultimately came from photosynthesis also. Fossil fuels are like fossilized remains of plants dating back hundreds of millions of years ago. And so that's still like ancient stores of the sun's energy that we're using to power something. So again, almost all heterotrophs depend on photoautotrophs, either directly or indirectly, for food and oxygen, because they produce oxygen as a byproduct. So, plants and other photosynthetic organisms have organelles called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are organelles, and they are structurally similar to and likely evolved from photosynthetic bacteria. So I believe we also mentioned this in the tour of the cell lecture, that both mitochondria and chloroplasts are really similar to bacteria or like some early proto prokaryote. And so they kind of just got taken up into a pre-eukaryote, and then evolved together in this like symbiosis. And so that's the endosymbiote theory. So yeah, chloroplasts are structurally similar to and likely evolved from photosynthetic bacteria. And the structural organization of these organelles are what allows for the chemical reactions of photosynthesis. So most photosynthesis in plants occurs in the leaves. So anything that you see is green is probably going to be doing photosynthesis. And yeah, most photosynthesis happens in the leaves. And so if we were to take a leaf and kind of do like a cross section, like cut it, like slice it, chloroplasts are mainly found in the cells of the mesophyll. It's like the interior tissue of the leaf. So if you like cut a slice of a leaf, there is like a top layer, a bottom layer, and that middle interior tissue of the leaf is called the mesophyll. And so these cells are typically where there are a bunch of chloroplasts and you do photosynthesis. And so for photosynthesis, you need carbon dioxide. So to get the carbon dioxide into those cells, there are these pores called stomata. In some cells, you might be able to see them. In some, they're, in some plants. And in some, they're microscopic. So carbon dioxide enters through those pores. And then as the cells do photosynthesis and make oxygen, that's how it leaves. So the plants basically breathe in through these little pores called stomata. In some plants, like house plants, it's recommended to dust your plants. So for example, with Monstera plants, it's recommended to dust them every now and then, like under and on top, because you want to make sure that the stomata have, access to those gases and exchanging. So you dust and make it easier for them to breathe, basically. And so veins in the plant help transport water from the roots and then export sugar that is made over here to the other parts of the plant that are non-photosynthetic. And so if we were to look at a chloroplast, this is kind of what it would look like. And we know what we know because we've seen it under the microscope. So this is an actual microscopic photo of like a slice of a chloroplast. So a chloroplast has an envelope of 2 membranes. So it has 2 membranes, this outer one called the outer membrane, and then this inner membrane. And so it's not that easy to see it in this picture, but yeah, there's 2 membranes. And then within those 2 membranes on the inside, there's this fluid called stroma. So if you see all this is the stroma in the chloroplast. It's kind of like analogous to the cytoplasm in a cell. And there are these sacs called thylakoids. And so if you were to like zoom in on one of these guys, it looks like a little pancake. It's like a little sac. Other ones, it's not just like one singular pancake. Some of them, like in this example, it's like they are connected pancakes. Maybe that's a bad example. But so this is like a connected sac. And then this is the next one, and then this is the next one. So each one of these is called a thylakoid. And so they have their own membrane. They're like a third membrane. And when they're stacked together, if there's a stack of thylakoids, then you could call them grana. Or a singular stack is granum. So this is one stack of thylakoids, a granum. And then if you're referring to like a bunch of them, that's grana, plural. And so chlorophyll is a pigment that gives leaves the green color that we, associate with leaves. And so if you notice, it's not that this whole chloroplast is green. There's just parts of it that are green, right? And so that's why in this figure, again, it's not like the whole solid chloroplast is green, even though in this tiny figure, maybe it looks like that. But what I'm saying is the green color comes from chlorophyll, this pigment molecule, and that lives inside of those thylakoids. And so that's why those are green. And it's not the whole thing that's green, it's the thylakoid because of the chlorophyll. I think it can be common to maybe confuse chloroplasts and chlorophyll, but chlorophyll is technically really tiny. It's like pigment molecules, and the chloroplast is the organelle that might look green, kind of, because the thylakoid's in there, but it's the pigment molecule that is chlorophyll that is green. And so if we look at the whole big picture chemical reaction of photosynthesis, similar to cellular respiration, it's a bunch of series of steps. It's not just one reaction, but this is how we can summarize it. So 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 12 molecules of water and the light energy from the sun help rearrange everything into glucose, oxygen, and water. So this is overall the chemical change that happens during photosynthesis. Again, it's multiple different steps. But if you notice, doesn't this look exactly like the opposite of cellular respiration? And it is. So in cellular respiration, you're taking glucose, right, and oxygen, and then you're breaking it down into carbon dioxide, water, and releasing or capturing energy in ATP. So this really is like the opposite. You're taking the carbon dioxide, well, the plants are, water, and then light energy, and then rearranging them to make sugar, like glucose, and then oxygen and water. So if you were to track all these molecules, you'll see how this happens. So chloroplasts are what split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then incorporate the electrons of hydrogen into sugar molecules, and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. So this is how those things get rearranged. Like, where do they go and where do they end up? It is a balanced chemical equation, so that 6 carbon atoms are still going to be on the products here in the glucose. And then the oxygen gets kind of like shuffled into these various molecules. And so all photosynthetic organisms require a hydrogen source, but that source varies among organisms. So for example, in plants, there's water. That's the hydrogen source. But in other photosynthetic organisms, they might need something else for that hydrogen. So for example, sulfur bacteria use hydrogen sulfide instead of water. And so this ends up forming yellow globules of sulfur as a waste product. So there's all kinds of different strategies and stuff out there for different organisms. And speaking of redox reactions, they come back to haunt us. So photosynthesis is a redox process. And in this case, water is oxidized because it gets its electrons robbed, basically. And then in this case, carbon dioxide is reduced because it gains electrons. And so this whole process is actually an endergonic process. You have to put in energy to make this happen. And in this case, the energy boost is provided by light. And so here's an overview of photosynthesis and what we're going to cover in the other parts of the lecture. So photosynthesis consists of 2 stages. The light reactions. So if we were to look at the word photosynthesis, the photo part is basically coming from the light reactions. And then the synthesis part is coming from the Calvin cycle. That's where you actually make the sugar. So you're taking the light energy and then using it to drive the actual making of molecules. Oops. So the light reactions and then the Calvin cycle. And we're going to talk in more detail about each one, but as an overview of the light reactions, these happen inside those thylakoids, those membrane sacs. So again, right here on the left. The light reactions split water molecules, providing electrons and protons. They release oxygen as a byproduct, reduce the electron acceptor NAD plus, in this case, or NADP plus, sorry. So that's like a slight difference in cellular respiration versus photosynthesis. One of the electron carriers here is NADP plus, so there's an extra. So when it gets reduced, it's reduced to NADPH. And then the light reactions also generate ATP from ADP by this process called photophosphorylation. And so the Calvin cycle, which is part 2, happens just in the stroma, so in that like fluid environment inside the chloroplasts. The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, and it makes sugar molecules from carbon dioxide using the ATP and NADPH made during those light reactions. The Calvin cycle starts with carbon fixation, and that incorporates carbon dioxide into other organic molecules. And then through this whole cycle, reduces fixed carbon dioxide to carbohydrates by transferring the electrons from NADPH. There's a couple typos here. I'll fix this. Yeah, so that's the big picture overview of the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. And so chloroplasts, to summarize it all, use the light energy to make sugar by coordinating those 2 stages of photosynthesis. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids and release NADPH and ATP to the stroma, and those get used in the Calvin cycle. Okay, so that is an overview of photosynthesis.